Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take those dense stacks of sources,
Yeah.
the articles, the reports, the policy memos, and we really boil them down for you. We give you the sharpest insights, the shortcut to really getting it.
And today, yeah, we're zeroing in on a really volatile connection point. Our sources, they map out this stark picture where um, global oil geopolitics, this huge interconnected system, slams right into a devastating political and human rights crisis in Venezuela.
It's a grim.
It is. And this deep dive, it's really about accountability, isn't it? Corporate interests, diplomatic leverage, and, the terrible cost ordinary people pay when a regime uses its oil wealth to just cement its grip on power.
So the core mission for us today, the big question we're trying to tackle, bridges that abstract world of energy markets with, well, the very concrete reality of state terror. How does the world's thirst for oil, we're talking over 100 million barrels every single day,
Yeah.
how does that affect human rights, political stability in the country sitting on the world's biggest reserves?
Right.
And critically, how are the big global players, especially the U.S., handling this? It's like a pressure cooker where energy needs and democratic values are just clashing head-on. It's a story of consumption, coercion, and deep strategic conflict.
It really is the classic energy security dilemma, but playing out right now, right in front of us. And these sources, they let us break down the specific, intricate pressures involved. So maybe let's start with just the sheer scale of this global habit that's driving everything.
Okay, let's get into the numbers because they really set the stage for why even small changes in oil production get so much attention. We're talking about a planet consuming, not year over year, but daily, over 100 million barrels of oil.
It's staggering.
And the forecasts, they don't show it slowing down. A lot of experts actually see demand increasing into 2024, even with the whole push towards renewables.
Yeah, and what's really crucial to grasp here is how deeply embedded, how necessary this stuff still is. When analysts talk about that 100 million barrels a day, they're stressing it's way more than just gas for cars or even fuel for ships and planes. Oil is foundational for the entire modern petrochemical industry.
So that means plastics, medicines, clothes, all that stuff.
Exactly. And even more fundamentally, it's about food security. Crude oil is essential for making fertilizer. So any disruption in oil supply, that can hit the global food supply chain hard.
Wow.
That deep integration, it makes the base demand incredibly sticky. You saw this even during the peak of the COVID lockdowns back in 2020. I mean, almost every major economy basically shut down, right?
Everything stopped.
But global oil demand only dipped by less than 10 million barrels a day. That remaining 90-something million barrels, that represents the sort of non-negotiable structural need of the global economy. It just has to be there.
And that structural need, that's what fuels this whole debate about the future of oil, isn't it? We hear so much about the energy transition, but the sources, they show this real split among experts about when peak oil demand will actually hit. What are those different forecasts telling us?
Yeah, there's a significant divergence there. On one hand, you've got institutions, say like BP, suggesting scenarios where peak demand, that point where consumption starts to permanently decline, could happen before 2030, driven by really aggressive climate policies.
Okay.
But then you have OPEC itself and, frankly, many major developing nations pushing back hard on that. They believe that strong growth in the developing world will keep pushing demand up, probably past 2030.
So uncertainty reigns.
Totally. For policymakers, for investors right now, that uncertainty means you basically have to plan for a world where 100 plus million barrels a day is still the baseline requirement for, well, the foreseeable future anyway.
And this huge, pretty inflexible demand, it creates instant geopolitical weak spots.
Yeah.
Nothing showed that more clearly than the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, Russia is still one of the world's top 3 oil producers. That invasion just completely scrambled the global energy map, didn't it? Put energy security right back at the top of everyone's list.
Oh, absolutely. That remapping, you could argue it's the single biggest shift in energy geopolitics we've seen in decades. And the paradox is fascinating. You've got all these Western sanctions, price caps, but Russia, it keeps producing, keeps selling its oil. Our sources show that in many periods after the invasion, Russia's export volumes were actually comparable to, sometimes even higher than, before the war.
Really? So the sanctions didn't block the supply?
Well, they certainly hit Russia's revenue per barrel, no doubt. But block the supply? No, it shows the limits of that sanctions regime, really.
Okay, so if the usual European pipelines are mostly off limits, how's Russia managing to keep selling so much? Where's all that crude going?
It's heading east, mostly by sea and at pretty steep discounts. China, Turkey, Singapore, they're named as big direct buyers. But Maybe the most sophisticated route involves India.
India. How so?
India's really leaned into this. They've got massive refining capacity, right? So they buy up this cheap Russian crude, sometimes called Urals grade, refine it, and then they re-export the finished products like gasoline or diesel globally. Often those products end up back in markets that officially shun Russian oil. It's a huge profitable workaround.
A massive arbitrage, basically.
Exactly, a huge arbitrage opportunity.
And moving all that oil, especially when you're trying to dodge Western insurance and shipping rules, that can't be easy. The sources talk about the logistics needed. It's not just finding buyers, is it?
No, absolutely not. It requires what the analysts call the shadow fleet. See, most major shipping companies, the big insurers, they're based in the West. They follow the sanctions. So Russia and its buyers have had to rely on this rapidly growing fleet of older tankers. Often they're not well maintained, ownership is murky, registered in flags of convenience, These ships frequently operate without standard Western insurance, which massively increases the risk of spills and accidents.
A huge environmental risk, then.
Definitely. But it's effective. It keeps millions of barrels flowing and helps explain why the global oil market, despite the war, has remained relatively balanced, surprisingly so.
Okay, so this delicate global balance, it's constantly being influenced, maybe manipulated, by OPEC plus might. That's the expanded group, now including countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, Mexico, even though they aren't official members. What's the main dynamic driving that group now?
Well, even with more players at the table, the sources are pretty clear. Saudi Arabia is still the one calling the shots. Venezuela might technically have the world's biggest reserves on paper.
Right, the potential.
But Saudi Arabia is the biggest producer within OPEC. They pump out, 10 to 11 million barrels a day, typically. They're basically the only ones with significant, reliable spare capacity. That makes them the market's swing producer, their decisions. They're driven by Saudi self-interest and maximizing their revenue.
And that self-interest led them to make a big call.
Yeah.
Cutting production by 1.2 million barrels a day. What was the thinking behind that cut? And why did it cause so much friction with the U.S.?
Well, the timing was key. That cut came when the market was already seen as pretty tight. Supply and demand were already close.
Okay.
So from the Saudi viewpoint, this was about boosting the price per barrel, maximizing revenue. It was also perhaps a signal that they wouldn't just follow Western requests, especially the U.S. desire to keep gasoline prices down for consumers. The analysts we looked at pointed out that cutting supply in an already tight market, that was a calculated move. It risked pushing energy prices higher, potentially causing inflation, which, always hits poorer, energy importing countries the hardest.
And this really throws the spotlight on that strained U.S.-Saudi relationship. The sources suggest U.S. energy independence, largely thanks to the shale boom, has really changed the power dynamic. America doesn't rely on Middle East oil like it used to.
Right.
But politically, stability there is still crucial.
Precisely. And that shift, it's emboldened Saudi Arabia. They're pursuing more of a non-aligned policy, especially regarding Russia and Ukraine. They're putting their own financial stability within that OPEC plus framework first. They're not just going to act as a price safety valve for the U.S. anymore. And that's what pushed the U.S. to take some pretty extraordinary steps domestically to shield consumers from those high prices after the Ukraine invasion kicked off.
Right. And the main tool there was the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. I think a lot of listeners remember that huge drawdown. We should probably dig into why the SPR exists and what the fallout from tapping it like that really was.
Yeah, absolutely. The SPR isn't just like a commercial stockpile. It's a national security asset. It was set up after the oil crisis back in '73. The idea is to provide a buffer militarily, economically, if there's a sudden severe supply shock. Think, a war in the Middle East shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, or a massive hurricane wiping out Gulf Coast production.
Okay, our real emergency fund.
Exactly. But in 2022, reacting to the price spikes from the Ukraine war, the U.S. released 180 million barrels. That was the single largest withdrawal in its entire history, nearly 50 years.
That's a massive amount. The goal was clearly to keep gas prices down, protect consumers from inflation. But what's the long-term consequence of draining it like that?
Well, the short-term goal, politically at least, was probably met. It did help bring down gasoline prices ahead of the 2022 midterm elections. But the long-term cost is significant. By the end of 2023, the SPR was at its lowest level since 1983.
Wow.
So now the U.S. faces this huge, complicated, and expensive task of refilling it. You have to buy back oil, often when prices are high. And the sources point out that even the effort to restock the SPR is bumping up against the tight global supply that OPEC OPEC Plus is deliberately maintaining.
So it shows the lengths the U.S. went to protect its own economy, but also its continued vulnerability to global markets, which brings us right back around to Venezuela. Okay, let's pivot now to Venezuela. Here you have a country with, on paper, the world's largest proven oil reserves. Huge potential. Yet its actual production today is just crippled. It's a classic case of immense natural wealth being completely strangled by what analysts always call above-ground risks.
Yeah, that's the term you hear constantly. The physical infrastructure, the refineries, pipelines, the pumps, it's all severely degraded. Years of mismanagement, corruption, just a total lack of investment and maintenance.
Right.
But the ultimate chokehold, it's political instability and, crucially, the long shadow of U.S. sanctions. For years now, U.S. policy has tried to use access to the oil market as its main lever to try and force Venezuela back towards some kind of democratic governance.
Let's trace how that sanctions policy evolved. It started under Obama, didn't it? More targeted, focusing on corruption, human rights abuses.
That's right. It began more narrowly. But then, under the Trump administration, it ramped up massively into what they called a maximum pressure campaign. That meant severe financial sanctions, sectoral sanctions hitting the whole economy, and critically targeting the state oil company, PDVSA. The clear aim was to starve the Maduro regime of foreign cash.
Okay, so then Biden comes in, and the strategy shifts, again, more towards this conditional idea, sanctions for democracy. How did that actually play out in late 2023?
Right. So following negotiations that led to something called the Barbados Agreement in October 2023, where Maduro's government basically promised to hold fair, internationally monitored elections in 2024, the Biden administration offered a temporary easing of sanctions for 6 months.
A carrot, essentially.
Exactly. The main tool was General License 44. It effectively allowed Venezuela's oil and gas sector, including PDVSA, to start doing business again with foreign partners, exporting crude, if certain political conditions were met.
That temporary relief, it was a big diplomatic gamble, right?
Mm-hmm.
Designed to encourage Maduro to follow through on the election promises. But, well, the sources make it clear that gamble didn't pay off politically.
No, it didn't. The relief was revoked in April 2024. The specific reason given was that the Maduro government had violated the core promises of the Barbados Agreement. The big one was upholding the ban preventing the main opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, from actually running for president.
So the deal was off.
Pretty much. By showing they wouldn't meet the political conditions, the U.S. snapped back to the pressure strategy. Although, it's worth noting, they didn't immediately reimpose all the previous sanctions with full force across the board. It was more targeted.
Now, right in the middle of this high-stakes diplomatic back and forth, there's this huge corporate player with unique standing, Chevron. The sources really detail its massive, almost outsized role in Venezuela's sanctions-hit economy.
Yeah, Chevron's continued operation there is kind of an anomaly. They operated under special licenses from the U.S. Treasury even during the maximum pressure phase. And their business, it is absolutely critical to the Maduro government.
How critical?
Sources suggest Chevron's joint ventures account for something like 20% of Venezuela's total crude exports, but maybe even more telling. That activity generates around 31% of the Maduro government's entire oil income.
31%, wow.
Chevron is, quite literally, one of the regime's most important financial lifelines.
Okay, so that explains Chevron's intense lobbying in Washington. Their public argument, as I recall, was basically that keeping their operations going helps global oil supply and therefore helps U.S. energy security. But, I mean, if the global market is 105 million barrels a day, and Chevron is providing almost a third of the regime's income, what's the real story behind that lobbying push?
That's a really sharp question, and it gets right to the core of what the sources are analyzing. Chevron's public argument that their Venezuelan oil is vital for global stability is pretty bluntly dismissed by former high-level officials like Elliot Abrams, who called it nonsense.
Why nonsense?
Because the numbers just don't add up for global impact. Even if Chevron operated at peak efficiency in Venezuela, the estimated production increase would only be around 300,000 to maybe 400,000 barrels a day.
Okay.
In a global market chewing through 105 million barrels a day. That's statistically tiny. It's barely a ripple.
So if it's not really about solving global supply tightness, what did the sources suggest were the real, maybe unstated reasons for Chevron wanting to stay?
The analysis points to a couple of deeper corporate motives. First, just protecting their existing investments and future potential. Chevron has poured billions into infrastructure, into these joint ventures over the years.
Sunk costs.
Exactly. Pulling out completely meant risking having all those assets permanently nationalized by the Venezuelan government. That would make it incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to ever get back in.
Okay, asset protection. What else?
Second, securing a long-term position. Venezuela still sits on the world's largest reserves, remember? By staying, even under restrictions, Chevron maintains a privileged position for whenever or if ever the political situation stabilizes. They get first dibs, essentially.
I see.
So that whole lobbying argument about energy security, it looks more like cover for a fundamental calculation about protecting assets long-term and securing future market access, even if the immediate consequence was handing a financial lifeline to the Maduro regime.
The conclusion seems pretty stark then. This global hunt for stable energy supplies, even marginal increases, effectively gave financial breathing room to a regime that was, at the very same time, ramping up its internal repression. So while Washington was playing this sanctions for democracy game, what was actually happening on the ground in Caracas?
Yeah, the regime wasn't just sitting idle. They were using that space, that financial leeway, to carry out a really brutal and effective consolidation of power. And that all culminated in the crisis right after the election.
Okay, let's shift to the summer of 2024. Specifically, that election result, which became the trigger, the pretext for this massive crackdown. Nicolas Maduro was declared the winner by the official election body, the CNE, claiming 51% of the vote. But the sources that looked at the actual precinct-level counts, they paint a completely different picture. Almost unbelievable, really.
They really do. The official CNE results were immediately hit with widespread, very credible allegations of fraud. Independent counts, based on the actual vote tallies from polling stations, the Actis widely reported that the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, had actually won by a landslide. Some counts put his share upwards of 67% of the vote.
Huge difference.
Massive. And the Maduro regime's response, it wasn't just political maneuvering. It was more like a preemptive strike using the military, the courts designed to just completely cement absolute authoritarian control.
And that strike was swift. Gonzalez Urrutia, the opposition candidate, had an arrest warrant slapped on him for terrorism, forcing him into exile in Spain. But the real depth of the situation, the gravity, is maybe best captured by the findings from the Organization of American States, the OAS panel of independent international experts. What did they conclude about where Venezuela stood?
The language the OAS panel used is incredibly stark, chilling, really. They concluded that Venezuela has moved beyond just systematically committing crimes against humanity. It has now consolidated what they called a fully matured authoritarian infrastructure.
A fully matured infrastructure.
Yeah.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the state isn't just relying on political control anymore. It's maintained through systemic fear, through violence, through basically erasing judicial process and ensuring total impunity for state actors. The repression isn't sporadic, it's centralized, it's deeply institutionalized, and it's aimed at tearing down the basic fabric of civil society itself.
That's a terrifying assessment. It means we need to look really closely at the specific tools of terror they used. Let's start with the mass detentions, under that sinister name, Operation Tuntun.
Yeah, Operation Tuntun. It's the sort of codified name for these sudden, warrantless home raids, usually late at night, carried out by state security forces, primarily SEBIN, which is the intelligence service, and DGCIM, military counterintelligence.
And this ramped up right after the election.
Aggressively. The sources documented over 2,400 arbitrary arrests in just the first 9 days after the election results were announced.
What was the point of that specific tactic? The nighttime raids, the sheer number.
The goal seems to have been instant, overwhelming psychological terror. The Tuntun that knock on the door in the middle of the night, it's designed to create this pervasive anxiety across the whole population, make people afraid to even think about resisting. And the sources show the repression deliberately focused on new targets, specifically the people and structures that could challenge the fraudulent election result.
So who were these specific new groups they went after to basically dismantle the opposition's evidence of victory?
The targeting was very strategic, very deliberate. First, electoral witnesses and polling station officers. These were the people who physically had the proof, the signed tally sheets showing the real vote count. They were explicitly targeted.
Right.
We have specific tragic cases mentioned, like Santiago Rocha. He was a polling officer arbitrarily detained in the notorious El Helicoide prison. He suffered from a serious neurological condition, and sources say he was deliberately denied urgent medical care while locked up. That's not just neglect, it's a form of torture aimed at breaking people, getting information, and punishing political participation.
Horrifying. Who else?
Second, residents of marginalized communities, the barrios. The data show that 75% of the people who came out to protest on the streets right after the election were from these poorer areas. This suggests the regime was hitting grassroots resistance where it was strongest, trying to decapitate that organizing capacity.
And the third group?
Third, and perhaps most disturbingly, minors. The reports documented 162 children detained, many swept up in these mass raids. It signals a policy of just indiscriminate persecution designed to terrorize entire families, entire communities.
So you have thousands arrested in days. What happened to them? The judicial system clearly wasn't functioning as a check on power.
No, quite the opposite. The judicial system became an active tool of state terror. It was completely instrumentalized to provide this thin facade of legality for mass persecution. Detainees were processed in these huge, opaque batches, often through what they called telematic hearings.
Telematic hearings, like video calls.
Exactly. Court conducted via video conferencing, often before these special terrorism courts, and this is where any semblance of due process just utterly collapsed.
How does using video calls specifically enable that kind of repression? What does it prevent?
Well, think about it. The detainee is physically separated from their lawyer, from the judge. There's no chance to have a private word with your counsel. There's no confidentiality, no real time to prepare a defense. The system just churns through cases at lightning speed, processing dozens of people in a matter of hours. It basically turns the courts into sentencing machines for political prisoners.
Wow.
The OAS panel was explicit. This system makes due process effectively impossible. It guarantees the state keeps total control over the story and the outcome.
And the human cost of this deliberate neglect, this weaponized system, is appalling, especially when you look at the deaths of political prisoners in custody.
The documentation is just damning. The panel confirms specific cases where political prisoners died because they were deliberately denied medical care while held by 7, or DGCI, and it's systemic, not accidental.
Yeah.
For example, Jesus Martinez Medina. He was detained for political reasons, had type 2 diabetes, and died because he was repeatedly denied the insulin and treatment he desperately needed. Similarly, Oscar Alexander Gonzalez, another political prisoner, was apparently misdiagnosed and died despite showing severe, life-threatening symptoms. It points to this policy of lethal indifference, maybe even intentional neglect, aimed at anyone deemed an enemy of the state.
And there's concealment, too?
Yes, absolutely. The case of Edwin Santos, for instance, he was forcibly disappeared last seen in DGCIM custody, and then the state claimed he died in a traffic accident. It just reinforces this pattern of calculated denial of any accountability.
Now, the regime didn't just use its official forces, right? They also brought in these irregular groups, the colectivos. How did their role change?
That's another key finding. The colectivos, these armed civilian groups, loyal to the regime, they used to be more like informal allies. But the sources indicate they've now been formally integrated into the state's repression machinery.
Integrated how?
They operate in direct coordination with state security forces. They're involved in things like home invasions, gathering intelligence on neighbors, carrying out acts of violence. This integration is useful for the regime. It lets them outsource some of the dirtiest work, maintaining this thin veneer of plausible deniability because the state systematically refuses to investigate anything the colectivos do.
And there's the modern twist. Weaponizing digital tools to spread fear.
Yeah, the digital angle is critical for the psychological terror aspect.
Yeah.
Take the Ven app. This app was promoted heavily by Maduro himself, encouraging citizens to use it to denounce enemies of the people.
Turning neighbors into informants.
Exactly. It creates the state-sponsored, crowd-sourced persecution network. It blurs the line between civic duty and authoritarian surveillance in a really insidious way.
And they use media against detainees too, right, to make examples of them.
Oh, absolutely. The regime actively produces propaganda using footage of detainees. The sources mention specific instances, like with Maria Oropeza, a political organizer. Footage of her arrest and detention was heavily edited. They added menacing music and then blasted it across state TV channels and social media.
It's not news reporting.
Not at all. It's psychological warfare. It's designed to dehumanize opponents, paint them as terrorists, and justify the state's extreme violence against them. It sends a message to anyone thinking of resisting.
Finally, we have to touch on the horrors documented by the OAS panel regarding torture and sexual violence.
Yeah, the findings there are deeply disturbing. The use of torture is described as pervasive, systemic across detention centers. The methods are brutal, electric shocks, Suffocation, like with plastic bags, mock executions, severe beatings.
It targeted gendered violence, too.
Yes. The sources specifically highlight the gendered persecution of female political prisoners. In places like the INOF prison, women faced horrific, inhumane conditions. Extreme overcrowding, being tear-gassed in their cells as punishment, systematic denial of medical care. The OAS panel concluded that this systematic violence, including the sexual violence frequently reported during interrogations, clearly meets the threshold for crimes against humanity under international law.
So this grim picture of internal terror consolidating inside Venezuela, it was happening against a backdrop of increasing external pressure, mainly from the U.S., particularly under the previous administration, which really escalated things into this tense, almost militarized situation focused on narcoterrorism claims.
Right. With the sort of sanctions for democracy approach faltering, the U.S. seemed left with fewer diplomatic tools, and the pressure shifted much more towards harder power. This really crystallized when the Trump administration ramped up the campaign, indicting Maduro personally and hiking the reward for his capture to a huge $50 million.
On narcoterrorism charges specifically.
Exactly. The core accusation was that Maduro was actively aiding drug cartels, and also street gangs like the notorious Tren de Aragua. That gang was later formally designated by the U.S. as a foreign terrorist organization.
This was a major escalation, moving way beyond just financial or diplomatic pressure. It even included actual military action in the area, what some sources called an undeclared war in the Caribbean.
That's where things got really kinetic, really high stakes. The U.S. Navy carried out 2 separate airstrikes. They targeted vessels in the southern Caribbean alleged to be smuggling drugs for Venezuela. These strikes killed a total of 14 people. The U.S. administration claimed they were narco-terrorists linked to Tren de Aragua.
How did Caracas react to the U.S. Navy conducting lethal strikes like that, arguably within their sphere of influence?
The reaction was furious, as you'd expect. Venezuela's defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, immediately condemned the strikes. He called them extrajudicial executions and explicitly labeled the U.S. actions an undeclared war.
Strong words.
Very. Maduro accused the U.S. of trying to force regime change through violent military means. Venezuela responded by launching its own military exercises, boosting its rhetoric about defending sovereignty against what they framed as direct U.S. aggression.
But the nature of those strikes, killing people without trial, outside a recognized war zone, drew a lot of legal questions, didn't it? From rights groups, even some U.S. lawmakers. What was the main legal issue raised in the sources?
The core legal challenge revolved around international law and human rights standards. Critics, including groups like Human Rights Watch, argued that drug smuggling, however illegal and damaging it is, doesn't actually constitute an armed conflict in the legal sense that would justify summary killings or extrajudicial executions under international law.
The legal threshold for lethal force.
Exactly. They questioned the legal basis for treating suspected drug traffickers as if they were enemy combatants who could just be killed without any due process, especially when this was happening outside of a declared hot war zone. It really highlights the danger, the legal gray areas, when a country uses narco-terrorism as a justification for military action against another sovereign state.
Yet, despite that legal scrutiny, the U.S. military presence in the region didn't really decrease, did it?
No, it remains robust. The U.S. maintains a significant force posture there. We're talking Aegis-guided missile destroyers, other warships, constant surveillance flights, even a strategic attack submarine deployed to the area. The stated mission is still countering drug trafficking organizations, but it undeniably serves as a constant, visible form of military pressure on the Maduro regime as well.
So you have this deeply unstable situation. Internal state terror, clashing with external military pressure framed as counterterrorism. A very volatile mix in the Caribbean. Hashtag tech outro. Well, this has been an incredibly detailed and, frankly, quite sobering deep dive. We started way up high with that abstract, almost unimaginable number, the world needing over 100 million barrels of oil every single day. And we've painstakingly traced how that global energy demand connects all the way down to the brutal realities on the ground in Caracas. The weaponized justice system, the crucial financial lifeline thrown by corporate interest, the terror of Operation Punton, and this tense militarized standoff in the Caribbean. It really lays bare the deep conflict, doesn't it? trying to secure energy supplies while also pushing for democracy against a regime that's just dug in so deep.
It really does. The Venezuelan situation is, tragically, just a textbook case study of how resource wealth can intersect with and maybe even fuel democratic collapse. That relentless global hunger for oil, the strategic drive for energy security, it's led repeatedly to policy choices like that temporary sanctions relief aimed at boosting supply, and talks that, whether intended or not, ended up providing financial oxygen to a regime.
Right.
And that regime used that very stability to double down on consolidating its power through systemic violence, through disappearances, through shredding the judicial system. It's a tragedy shaped actively by global market forces and geopolitics.
So the question really becomes, how does the world respond now, facing a regime described as a fully matured authoritarian infrastructure built on fear?
Which I think brings us to the final, maybe unavoidable and definitely provocative question we want to leave you, the listener, with. Given this overwhelming evidence, documented evidence, of state-sanctioned torture, of the judiciary being used as a weapon, and the clear failure of diplomacy and limited economic measures to stop these abuses, the question really shifts, doesn't it?
How so?
It's no longer if these are crimes against humanity. The evidence seems clear on that. The question becomes, what level of external economic pressure, maybe even contemplating a full blockade of Venezuelan oil exports, is actually required to dismantle this entrenched system of state terror?
A huge step.
A huge step. And crucially, if applying that kind of extreme pressure directly conflicts with the world's need for stable energy supplies, is the world genuinely willing to accept significantly higher oil prices, more market chaos, to try and stop the consolidation of state terror in Venezuela? That choice, that calculation, reveals the true, often uncomfortable price of geopolitical action and moral accountability.